Just a heads up before we get into today's episode, this deep dive contains discussion of distressing themes, including sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
On Friday, a Canadian judge found 5 professional ice hockey players not guilty of sexual assault charges. The 5 players were part of Canada's 2018 World Junior Hockey Championship team and were accused of assaulting a woman in a hotel room while celebrating their victory. The multi-year case exposed serious issues within Hockey Canada, the peak body of the sport, and has attracted intense international attention around the definition of consent. On today's podcast, Em and I are going to break down what happened in this case, how we got here, and what this verdict means now.
Sam, before we get into the details of this case, which, as you flagged, has been this long-running saga in Canada, can you give us some background on who these players are? And also, I think, the significance of Canadian hockey. Obviously, for us here in Australia, this is not a hockey country per se, but in a country like Canada, ice hockey is a massive, massive deal, right?
It is, and the significance of the sport and the way it's intertwined with government and the standing of hockey players is a really important part of this story. So it makes sense to talk through all of that.
It's Canada's AFL, right?
It might actually bigger than that, I think, because it's not like it's even got a competitor. It is the unifying sport of Canada. So the 5 players that we're talking about today are Carter Hart, Michael McLeod, Dylan Dubé, Alex Fermenton, and Carl Foote. They're now aged between 25 and 27, and at the time of the alleged incident in 2018, they were all part of Canada's World Junior Championship team. Now, the World Junior Championship is a massive deal in Canadian hockey. It's an annual tournament for players who are under 20, so it's like the Rising Stars kind of scene. And making the team is considered a huge stepping stone towards professional careers. 4 of these 5 players that we're talking about went on to play in the NHL, which is the world's premier ice hockey league. Okay,
so talk me through the allegations made against this group of young players.
So the allegations centre around an incident that took place in January of 2018 at a hotel in Ontario following a team celebration. The alleged victim, who was referred to in the court proceedings as EM, was 20 years old at the time. Now, according to her testimony, she went to the hotel room for consensual sex with one of the players, Michael McLeod, but she told the court she was shocked and scared when 4 other players arrived. She testified that she felt like she was in autopilot mode and felt numb and outnumbered during what followed. And it was originally reported that 8 players were involved, but only 5 are actually named in this court proceeding.
Okay.
And so the defense teams for all 5 players, and it's worth noting that they were all individually represented by different defense teams, they argued generally that EM had consensually participated in all of the sexual activities, which included sexual intercourse with all 5 of the men, and they presented video evidence from the night, which they claimed proved her consent.
Okay, so 5 players all charged over essentially alleged rape in a hotel room against this unnamed victim. She is identified as under the initials EM. It's a case that we know has been going on for 7 years. So I want to understand kind of the long-running nature of these proceedings. How did it all first come to light?
Well, this is the really complicated part of this story. So there's a bit of a timeline here. In 2018, EM told family members about the alleged assault. The family members then reported it to Hockey Canada, this peak organisation. Hockey Canada then informed local police and began their own internal investigation. Now, at this stage, the players themselves weren't told about the complaint or either investigation.
Okay.
And then by 2020, both investigations had concluded. Police decided not to lay charges, and Hockey Canada's investigation remained confidential, and we still don't know what the results of that investigation were. And that's where things sat for the next 2 years. The players still didn't know what had happened.
Okay, so police have been involved. The sports peak body has been investigating, but the alleged victim herself hadn't actually sought to press charges criminally per se. So what changed? How did the world find out about this story?
So we have these investigations that wrap up in 2020. In May of 2022, a sport news outlet called TSN publicly revealed the allegations for the first time. And in that reporting, TSN also revealed that Hockey Canada had quietly paid millions of dollars to settle a sexual assault claim without the players knowing about it.
Wow.
And that triggered a massive scandal. And Canadian police reopened their criminal investigation based on new information, and another news outlet, the Globe and Mail newspaper, it reported that Hockey Canada had a dedicated fund for settling sexual assault cases against its players.
So an internal investigation that I'm sure this organisation had hoped would go away quietly with a settlement deal reached with the alleged victim becomes a kind of national scandal about the sport more broadly.
Yeah.
Tell me about this dedicated fund. What does that actually mean and look like?
So Hockey Canada is an organisation partially funded by the Canadian government. So when this reporting came out, there was this immense scrutiny from the government as to whether any taxpayer funds had been used in the settlements.
Interesting.
Hockey Canada executives later told Canada's parliament in a number of hearings that the organisation had paid millions across 21 separate cases since 1989 to alleged victims of sexual assault. And the fallout was swift and severe. So major corporate sponsors like Nike and Scotiabank terminated their agreements with Hockey Canada. The entire board of directors stepped down, the CEO resigned, the Canadian government pulled all funding until new leadership was installed. And this new leadership eventually acknowledged there were systemic issues in the culture of the organisation and the culture of hockey more broadly.
This is massive. I keep kind of trying to imagine an equivalent scandal like this happening, for example, in the AFL, what it would be like for the entire board to step down, these kind of decades-long revelations of cover-ups. I'm sure it would dominate the news cycle here, and there would be calls for legal proceedings. So that is kind of what we have seen in Canada.
Yep.
So let's talk about the trial itself. Tell me about the legal process. What did that look like?
Okay, so we're at 2022 when these reports come out. It's then 2024, January 2024, when police finally do lay sexual assault charges against these 5 players. They all plead not guilty, and the charges carry a maximum prison sentence of 10 years. The trial began in May of this year, so a couple of months ago. It was not a smooth trial. The first jury had to be dismissed after a defense lawyer accidentally encountered one of the jurors during a lunch break. A second jury was selected. They were also dismissed after jurors complained to the judge that the defense lawyers were, quote, judging and making fun of them. So at that point, there had been 2 juries who had come through the courtroom and been dismissed. There were obviously some serious delays to the progress of this trial. And at that point, the judge made the rare decision to proceed without a jury at all, and she would make the call herself.
Okay, so because it was such a high-profile case, there's obviously always concerns with these kinds of trials that a jury will find it hard to not be swayed by the public discourse or disconnect from that. But this sounds like kind of misconduct from the defense lawyers.
Yeah, it's not typically the reasons we see juries dismissed in these high-profile cases.
Yeah, I was going to say it seems quite unusual.
And at the time of dismissing the second jury and making the decision to go to a judge-only trial, there were notes about the impact on the alleged victim and of the defendants themselves of an unnecessary extension of this trial.
Yeah, because when a jury is dismissed, a retrial is called, then proceedings start from scratch,
exactly,
which can be re-traumatizing for victims and distressing if you are being prosecuted unfairly.
And it's very unusual in the Canadian system, but it did mean that Justice Maria Carokia did continue as the sole decision maker. So then we got to the actual trial itself, and the alleged victim testified for 9 days total. That included 8 days of cross-examination by the 5 defense teams. The court was shown extensive video, photographic, and electronic messaging evidence, plus character references for the defendant. Now, only one of the 5 accused chose to take the stand himself.
Hi there, my name's Emma. I'm the editor at the Daily Aus, just popping in to say hi and let you know that here at the Daily Aus, we are an independent media company who work to break down the news for young Aussies in a digestible and accessible way. If you like what you're watching and you like what we do, please hit the subscribe button. Now back to the video. What did we learn from that one accused player who took the stand? Did we learn anything?
Ultimately, what we learned was that from the perception of the accused, this was a consensual sexual encounter that was with a willing participant and was at no point along the journey made aware of the fact that there was not consent offered or continued. So it was really just a way to bring a first-person perspective to what the defense teams, the 5 defense teams, had been trying to prosecute in this case. The other interesting part of his testimony, though, was the discussions about the impact on his sporting career. And that becomes relevant in a minute.
All right. So just to recap, it's like we almost have 5 trials, 5 mini trials within this bigger trial, because we have 5 defendants, 5 defense teams. Then on Friday, we did finally get a judgment in this long-running saga. What did the judge conclude?
Yeah, so on Friday, the judge found all 5 defendants not guilty. The judge told the courtroom that she did not find EM's evidence to be, quote, credible or reliable. And in giving her decision, she cited inconsistencies in EM's testimony, particularly around her claims about her level of intoxication and her mental state, which the judge said did not affect EM's ability to consent.
Okay. What has the response been like to this verdict? With so much attention on this case, I'm sure there has been some division with this ruling.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, outside of court, there was a large public presence with a lot of demonstrators, and then lawyers came out and both sides gave statements. So the lawyers for EM, the alleged victim, said that she was very disappointed with the court's assessment of her credibility. One of EM's lawyers, Karen Belhumer, was particularly critical of how EM was treated during the trial itself.
Her treatment during cross-examination at times was insulting, unfair, mocking, and disrespectful, none of which was necessary. Yet she maintained her composure and kept her emotions in check, only to be criticized for not acting enough like a victim.
Meanwhile, lawyers for the 5 men said their clients were pleased with the verdict, but they did acknowledge that the damage to their reputations and the 5 men's sporting careers had been, quote, significant.
The Crown Attorney did not have to take this case to trial. Mr. Hart, in particular, was willing to engage in a restorative justice process. He was willing to be publicly named and prepared to use his public platform to teach other athletes about how to ensure that their sexual encounters are responsible and thoughtful. Instead of pursuing restorative justice, the Crown forced a distressing and unnecessary trial to the detriment of Mr. Hart, his co-defendants, the complainant, and the Canadian public.
Okay, so we have this legal trial against 5 men who were charged with sexual assault years after the alleged incident took place. With so many of these cases, we see the evidence is largely hearsay if it is a historic allegation. Ultimately, the men have been cleared. So what has been the reaction from the sporting body, the NHL, which faced this kind of controversy and criticism over these decades of cover-ups, of payouts, of this taxpayer funding potentially being misused? Are the 5 men going to be granted back into the sport?
Well, firstly, I just want to say how weird it is to go straight to the sporting careers. And I think that it's important to acknowledge, you and I chatted about how to kind of bring this into the story, but it's an important aspect because of the cultural reckoning that this case has triggered within the sport in Canada. And as you said earlier, this is the biggest sport in the country. And so the NHL has been under a lot of pressure to handle this judgment whichever way it went in the right way. And so they released a statement just after the verdict was announced and said that the 5 men would remain ineligible to play until it determines next steps. And they released this statement saying that even though the allegations weren't proven to be criminal, the behaviour at issue was unacceptable.
Okay, and I suppose that speaks to whatever happened in that room on that night. We know that 5 athletes representing a national sport did engage in some kind of sexual misconduct under what a sporting kind of body would consider misconduct.
Yeah, I don't think it was a particularly surprising response from the NHL, but the NHL Players Association, which would represent the interests of the 5 men because they are potential or current players of the NHL.
Yeah.
They took a very different position. They argued the players, quote, should now have the opportunity to return to work, and said that they'll address this dispute directly with the NHL.
It's an interesting one for sure, because regardless of kind of what athletes' wishes are, when you play at a professional level, you do become an ambassador, a role model for the sport. With these kind of big picture conversations and questions looming over sport and integrity, I wanted to zoom out and talk to you, Sam, about why you think this case was so significant in Canada, why it's attracted so much attention around the world, you know, to the point that you and I are talking about it here today.
Sure. I think that ultimately this just exposed so much more than the facts of the case itself. It exposed massive issues within Canadian hockey and Canadian hockey culture. And the fact that Hockey Canada had paid out millions across 21 cases since 1989 does suggest that this was not an isolated incident, and that this is a story that, you know, booted out an entire leadership of the biggest sporting organisation in the country. I also think, in looking at the reactions from the lawyers outside of court on Friday, that this case really did raise difficult questions for Canadians about consent and how sexual assault allegations are handled in their justice system and within sporting bodies. There was a piece of analysis from researchers from Canada's Western University published in The Conversation, and I wanted to end on this quote. The researchers said, the events examined in this most recent trial are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of deeper systemic failures within elite sport. Until sport organisations address the foundational cultural elements that enable misconduct, toxic masculinity, institutional protection, and erosion of consent culture, meaningful change will remain elusive.
Some really powerful words there from those researchers with Canada's Western University, and a fascinating case. Sam, thank you so much for walking us through all of that today.
Of course, thanks, Em.
That's all for today's deep dive. Thank you so much for listening. If this episode has raised any concerns with you, help is available through 1-800-RESPECT. We'll pop some resources in the episode description.